Hi man, I've resorted to trying to do an assembly on my interactive whiteboard. Unfortunately, I don't have the IT skills to share content on screen, all that stuff. Anyway, guess what this one's about? A familiar scene, anybody who's had to sit in my classroom listening to my awful stories, sometimes you're much more interested in the pile of Lyle's Golden Syrup cans, which are above the middle window. And as you can see, they're still there. That's a photograph I took earlier this morning. So that's what this assembly is about. It's about Lyle's Golden Syrup. Okay. So where do we start with that? Well, let's start off with what I would refer to as the iconic image of the actual tin of Lyle's Golden Syrup. So that's where it begins for me. That's why I have a pile of them in my classroom, and that's why I every so often encourage people to ask me to talk about them. And I do this as a wee sort of exercise anyway, and inquisitive minds can find something to learn in almost anything, even a can that's sitting on top of a windowsill. But I'm also going to relate it to lockdown and just think about how the three things that I want to talk about this can relate to lockdown. Okay, so the first one, really simple. Those of you who haven't heard of him before, this is Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol was an amazing modern artist of the 1960s and beyond. You notice that on the sort of Wikipedia image hit there gives you Marilyn Monroe's and other things, but actually this iconic figure was most famous probably for doing repetitive imagery of everyday ordinary objects. And for us at Campbell College, it's quite interesting that one of the famous ones is the Campbell soup tins. So this is hand painted. It's not a poster, it's actually a piece of art. And pop art, which is short for popular art, in the same way that pop music is short for popular music, was an attempt to say, we used to have classical music, now we've got pop music. We used to have classical art, now we can have popular art. Art is there in the eye of the beholder, in the everyday things that are around us. And he's also really famous in everyday terms for doing Coca-Cola imagery. So that's your Coca-Cola bottle. And I do think that the original wee Coca-Cola bottle is a thing of great beauty. I remember buying an actual original bottle as a souvenir to bring home from America once. But what I'm saying is that when you take something that is as iconic as that image, which hasn't changed, I believe since 1881, I think there's a date somewhere on. That's basically the same iconic artistic imagery that's used again and again by Lyle's, the manufacturers, since the very beginning. And I think that that's a work of art. I think that's really attractive and really good to look at. So from an artistic point of view, my first learning curve is pop art. Now, how does that relate to lockdown? Well, art is all around us. Okay, so that's the sort of thing you stop and you take note of and you think about when you have time, and you have more time in your hands now than possibly ever before, to stop and think how the world of art, and whether that's sculpture, painting, tapestry, album art, whether it's posters, whether it's film and moving image, and some of you will be next year beginning a new subject of moving image art. Some of you were doing that previously. Look at the art out around you and decide, what is beautiful and what is artistic. Okay, so that's strike one. Okay, strike two for me is, this was a Daily Mail article from years ago. I thought it was sleeping. Golden Syrup fans are shocked by online post pointing out that the Lyle's logo is a dead lion. Well, okay, fair enough. Let's have a look at that. So they're pointing towards this idea. I've done you a slightly bigger version of the right hand one, which shows the dead lion image in the middle of the canon. It says, out of the strong came forth sweetness. So, what that is a slight paraphrase of a quote from the King James Version of the Bible. The story, and to some extent the story is a separate issue. You can research this in greater detail if you want, but the story is the story of Samson, the famous long-haired strongman, who was on his way to an event, and he was attacked by a lion. He had to kill a lion with his bare hands. And coming home 2 or 3 days later, he noted with great interest that bees had actually found the carcass of the lion and were feeding on it. And of course those bees eventually created honey. It actually says in the Bible, in the book of Judges in the Bible, that Samson actually collected honey from the bees, and then he fed that honey to guests at a family event, including his own parents. And he created a riddle about it. Out of the eater we eat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. So I like that because I like the concept of it being a riddle. But most importantly of all, I like the tone and poetic nature of the quote. Now, of course, that has a further link, because I've already mentioned the Bible. And then when you start to think, well, what version of the Bible? What if it's the King James Version of the Bible, okay, which, as it says in one of the slides there, was originally published in 1611. So it seems like no time ago, but it's actually 9 years ago when we had the 400-year anniversary of the King James Version of the Bible. So King James, the king who assumed the throne after Queen Elizabeth I, he was the person. Yeah, there had been other very worthy attempts to create a version of the Bible, including the Tyndale Bible, a famous Bible in English. But this is a really famous and well-received version of the Bible in English, which he basically authorized. He put together the team of people who came up with an English version of the Bible from the original Hebrew, Greek and Latin versions that were available, and it became known as the KJV, the King James Version, and published in 1611. It's the one that we kind of look on nowadays as the original old version of the Bible. Now, of course, there's another link there for me as an English teacher, which is good old Shakespeare. Because who was writing around the time of the early 1600s? Well, of course, it was William Shakespeare. In fact, William Shakespeare, as it says here in this slide, his company, which were originally called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, they became the King's Men when James I became king in 1603. So King James was such a fan of Shakespeare's theatre company that he allowed them to rename themselves the King's Men. So the man who authorized this version of the Bible, and the man who gave Shakespeare the predominance that he had in his lifetime, which almost no one else had, that's the man of the same language of both out of the strong came forth sweetness, and of course all the famous verses in the Bible, you know, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, those sorts of ideas. Now there are two things then that come out of that for me. One is this idea is many people will turn to religion, and certainly your spirituality will be something that you may well have examined carefully over the last few weeks. Even if you're not religious, you may have become more spiritual in thinking about, you know, the whole purpose of life and our place in existence and why we're here and whether there is a God or not. So that's worth thinking about, King James Version of the Bible, and of course literature, because some of us have read more than ever in the last 8 weeks. You may not have been reading much Shakespeare, but actually, if you're not in year 11, you won't probably have it all. But it's a good time to go away and think, now, what's all the fuss about? And instead of reading Shakespeare, I would say to you, look up a couple of really good versions of Shakespearean plays which are recorded and filmed and are available free on YouTube, and try and work out what's all the fuss about. This guy's meant to be amazing. What's all the fuss about? That's my second thing. Third thing's probably even simpler. I'm looking for my slide. The third thing is that iconic image, which for me is the actual substance in the can. And really that relates to my childhood. Sadly, I've always been pretty much a small, fat person, because my mummy, who was an absolutely lovely mummy, passed away in '05. She was from a family who were inclined to be small and chubby, and she unfortunately gave me, she was a feeder, and she gave me a taste for Lyle's Golden Syrup, which I haven't lost to this day. So my idea of a treat in childhood, as well as all the usual treats that people like, crisps and chocolate and all those things, I also, to this day, have an absolute treat in a piece of plain bread, thickly buttered and thickly spread with Lyle's Golden Syrup out of a tin. And where's the link there? Well, we've all eaten more over the last few weeks in lockdown than we probably ever have. We have to be careful what we eat. We have to go out and exercise to make sure that we find some sort of balance between our intake and what we're burning off. But it's also a family thing. You see, I mentioned poetry in the verse of the Bible, and I mentioned literature in the King James Version. But most of poetry is about our experiences as a child or family experiences. Someday I'd love to write a poem which is about feeling as a child how lucky I was that I was able to have somebody who gave me those sorts of treats. That's a really personal, simple childhood memory, which I believe any of us share, and it's a way of stopping and thinking, instead of a current trend in the lockdown, which is lots of people seem to be starting to complain a lot about how much it has affected them. Maybe it's an opportunity to stop and talk about how lucky we are that we've been able to manage to get through this surrounded by people who care for us. So thank you for listening to this week's assembly.